Hi, my name is Mark Bullenbach. I lead the product team for process orchestration at Appian. And by way of introduction, let me just tell you a little story about how I got to be here talking to you today. So about 6 years ago, I was working at another company on an integration platform for the company's suite of enterprise applications. And we were about 3 years into this journey when we realized that we really needed to do a better job, provide better tooling for our customers to develop, or rather to configure, their integration flows. And we're pitching the idea to our executive team, and our CTO says to me, hey Mark, this sounds a lot like low-code development. Who do you think we are, Appian? Now, ironically, 3 years later, I'm actually starting to work at Appian in our core components and frameworks. And I've got this preconceived idea of what Appian is all about. Based on that kind of anecdote from my CTO, I've been through the training at Appian, and I'm thinking user-centric applications and workflows, right? But then as I started to dig into how customers were actually using the Appian platform, I realized that that was only part of the story. And a number of our customers were actually using it for what we call like unattended processes. Some of you might consider this headless processes, where there's really no user in the workflow. And as the integration guy coming, with a lot of integration experience, I was like, wow, this is really cool. And I started to see Appian in a whole different light. And as I dug in, again, a little bit further, I started to say, if we could make some improvements here and there, we could really scale the platform to be applicable for higher throughput, higher volume use cases. And that's really what we're here to talk to you about today. Now, first, a little bit of a disclaimer, the fine print. We are going to be talking a little bit about some futures. This is all active development. We're going to talk about our beta program, but there are some things that are a little bit further out. And if you've been around software, well, all of you have been around software development, right? You know that plans change. And so I just want you to know, as we use terms like we plan or we intend to, et cetera, we will point some of this out, but just understand that plans can change, and this is not necessarily a commitment on some of the things that we'll talk about, all right? So without that out of the way, let me just talk kind of how the rest of the presentation is gonna go. I will come back to my initial assertion that a number of our customers are using Appian for unattended processes today, quite successfully, I might add. I'm gonna cover those use cases, talk a little about some of the scalability requirements, and give you a little teaser on how we scale Appian today. But then that also will highlight some of the needs that we have, and I will introduce then autoscaling for process execution. And then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague here to take you a little bit deeper.
Hi, good afternoon all. I'm Tejas. I'm a senior product manager at Appian, focused specifically on process orchestration. And following up on Mark's introduction of autoscaling, I'm going to give you a glimpse of autoscaling in action, specifically walking you through the developer experience, the performance benchmarking results, so you get an insight into the Appian's next generation process execution engine. After that, I'm going to give you some guidance on whether to determine if autoscaling is going to be a right choice for you right now. And then finally, I'll conclude by giving it back to Mark to talk about what lies ahead.
Thanks, Tejas. Okay, so first use case. One of our customers is a bank in Southeast Asia. They started in 2022 as a digital-first bank, servicing both businesses and consumers. And one of the ideas that they had was to be able to service personal loans, micro loans for consumers. And what they did was, using their existing web portal, they exposed an Appian process model that really took in all of the application and the decision process for this loan assessment, okay? It's a completely headless process. There's no user interaction, no user intervention in the back end. Even those types of those scenarios where the loan applicant is kind of questionable and it could be delegated to someone to actually make a decision, they just go ahead and reject those and send a response to the user. So this is an example of a straight-through process. We consider this a straight-through process. It's a form of an unattended process, that's how Appian's being used today. Or you can take another financial institution that one of our customers. This one's a much larger global institution with a number of different subsidiaries. And the way in which they use Appian is similar and yet slightly different. Okay? The similarities are that they expose processes via web APIs. Here, though, the difference is that, and again, they're using a pre-existing front end. The difference here is that in this scenario, there's a lot more synchronous interaction between the front end and the back end serviced by Appian. So here, it's more of a service orientation, service orchestration type of a use case. For those of you who know the process model, there's a lot of chaining involved between the nodes and smart services, but it's essentially returning a response back to the user interface so that the process can continue. Not exactly headless, but I mean the process itself, if you take away the user interaction that's triggering the process, it's still considered a headless process from Appian's perspective, because we're not using any of the user interface components. All right, now to drive this point home, I'm going to go back to Southeast Asia for another one of our financial institutions, and note that all of these are finance-oriented. There's a couple of other examples coming up that are not finance-oriented, so just stay tuned. But here's this bank, and the reason I bring these guys up, one is the similarities. Again, they're using this as a service orchestrator in the back end, kind of like middleware. Again, being the integration guy, I'm kind of excited about this because this is the types of applications that I've used in the past. But I bring this up mostly to talk about scale. 1.7 billion process instances in 2023. It's huge. In fact, this is one of the largest implementations in Appian Cloud that we have today. Now, there's some caveats. They've actually split across a number of different environments, okay? But that aside, it just shows the way in which Appian can be used for these high-scale, high-throughput processes. And in fact, they're intending to increase about 30% as they bring more processes online. All right, so the main point here is that we have the ability to scale, and the question is, how do we scale Appian in the current architecture? Well, in Appian Cloud, we actually have a distributed environment with discrete components that can be scaled independently. All right, on the far left, I got to remember that I've got slides here and you got slides there. The web server really front ends everything, serves dynamic pages, static pages, actually offloads some of the processing capacity off of the application server. So, and also really prevents kind of heinous traffic coming into the environment. On the far right side is the database, and here I'm talking about the database, not as much the Appian data service or data fabric, but I'm making out the point that Appian can really, it requires a database to operate, right? And so any of the supported databases, relational databases can be used. In Appian Cloud, we actually give you an instance of MariaDB to use, and first and foremost, to provide the metadata for Appian, but it can also be used for your business applications. But at the core, you have the application server and the Appian engines. The application server provides capabilities like integration calls. It provides the runtime environment for your user interface components, records, etc. Whereas the engines are like the process engine for driving processes. It also provides for user authentication, group management, content management, and others, the engines as a whole. And then undergirding all of this is a distributed file system that can be scaled independently of all those other components. So what? You might be asking that question. So what, Mark? What's your point? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because the point here is that scalability in this kind of environment, I mean, like if you think about issues with the database, we can tune your database. We can actually move your database to a separate EC2 instance, or we can actually, you can bring your own database and not really have any kind of constraints associated with that at all. Use it however you want. On the engine side, if you need additional throughput, we can add additional engine shards, we can add CPUs, memory, etc. But all of these kinds of changes require some planning, some thought, some planning, some analysis, and then probably some downtime. And whereas that may be okay when you're talking about a known set of users in a back end, it's not as applicable when you start exposing services outside your own walls, okay? And so think about this. If you're servicing users via web portal, traffic is really an unknown quantity. You can understand or you can project what you think it's going to be, but you really don't know until it hits you. And that was one of the examples, actually one of these financial institutions that I talked about. They actually, their marketing efforts and their loans were so good, either, and I don't know if that's fortunately or unfortunately, they had a huge, they were projecting that there were going to be about 10,000 applicants per month. It ended up being 50,000 applicants in the first month. And they weren't necessarily prepared and required emergency scaling of their environment in order to meet the demand. Similarly, if you think about on the data side, think about, I mean, and this may not be as applicable for Appian, but a social media application. If you've got an event, whether it's like Allison talked about, a Taylor Swift concert, or it's maybe it's an eclipse or an election, right? You're going to have a lot more data-oriented traffic, a lot more posts, a lot more sharing, a lot more comments, which puts a lot of additional requirements on your data layer. And then finally, anything that's process-oriented or transaction-oriented. Think about something that an application that's monitoring stock trades and has to either do trading, automatically, or have alert somebody to take care of things, like to cover margins for like margin loans. In those cases, in periods of market volatility, what happens? The data stream increases, the number of process instances increase, the need for processing capacity increases. As I mentioned before, these types of use cases are not constrained to the financial services industry. Talked about loan processing under this heading of straight-through processing, but in addition, think just product or service or ordering. Again, increase in traffic requires increased scalability. Service or microservice orchestration, but also scheduled processing. You might have periods at which your processing needs increase, whether that's month-end processing or year-end processing. So what we're really looking at is this need for variability of processing capacity based on demand. Now, what are the business drivers behind this? First, it's high performance. In today's landscape, in order for businesses to grow and thrive, you really need speed and efficiency. All these three, by the way, are really interrelated. The mission-critical applications have to process more data, service more users, handle more transactions than ever before. And as we've mentioned several times now, that demand can actually vary based, whether it's time-based or whether it's just usage-based. And so on-demand scaling is really becoming more critical and more important as we move forward. And there needs to be this ability to scale really based on demand. Why? Because really in an environment where every penny counts, you have to be careful about your investments, especially in IT. And you don't want to over-provision resources to meet demand, and you also don't want to be in kind of the position where you actually have to do this on an emergency basis, because that can be costly as well. And these reasons really are why we built Autoscaling for process execution. Now, what is autoscaling for process execution? I'm going to poke fun at us a little bit in just a slide, but you heard on this main stage this term EPEX, but also autoscaling for process execution. How do these two things interrelate? Well, in its simplest terms, autoscaling for process execution is a new mode of operation for processes, as Allison talked about in the keynote. Now, with autoscaling, essentially, as we've been talking about, resources are scaled up, as process instances or as demand increases, but then they're also scaled down as demand decreases. That really provides efficient use of resources and importantly, without any kind of outage. This is done automatically for you. Now, I went the wrong way. Autoscaling for process execution is powered by a new elastically scalable process engine that we refer to as EPEX. And this is where I kind of poke fun at us. We want to position this as autoscaling for process execution, but EPEX just sounds cool and sounds sexy, and so the marketing people like to use that term a lot, much to my chagrin. But nevertheless, we're really proud of this. And the idea here, though, was the reality is this engine can really scale to billions of process nodes being processed in a single day. Okay, this is not process instances. This is actually the individual nodes and smart services that would be executing in a process. We've scaled this up and Tejas will talk more about this, in the billions. Again, elastic scalability. I won't beat that horse. But the other piece that I think is really exciting and you should be excited about is that it works with your the existing process modeler and process models. Now there's some caveats associated with that, which we'll get into, but it's essentially going to be, from a designer's perspective, it's transparent, and that's why we didn't really want to focus on the engine as much as this new capability that we have in the modeler, which is called autoscaling for process execution. All right, so the main point to take away from this slide is that autoscaling for process execution is a new mode of processing within the Appian platform, and it's powered by a new engine called EPEX. Now, for the technologists in the office, let me just say a few words about the engine. First, it's actually somewhat componentized in and of itself. There are these little small mini web apps or called executors. That's really where the processing capacity comes from. And the executors are what we scale up and scale down based on demand. They are stateless, they're multi-threaded, and processing of nodes in a process model can actually be distributed across them without any bounds. Yet again, elasticity. EPEX will monitor a queue to determine how much traffic is in the queue, and based on thresholds that can be tailored per customer, we can actually scale that up and down as needed. And again, it's without any kind of outage. And finally, this is all built on Appian's Kubernetes cloud native architecture, which also gives us portability. We'll talk a little bit about how this will affect or benefit our self-managed customers. Right now, it's just going to be available in Appian Cloud. We'll cover that a little bit later on in the presentation. But essentially, the other aspect to this that is really important is that we're isolating execution to these executors. And what this does is it offloads capacity off of your application server, which actually frees up capacity for your user-centric applications. Okay, now if all that is a little bit too technical or esoteric, I'm going to pass the mic over to Tejas to kind of show you a little bit more about what this looks like and how we've been testing it internally and how our beta customers have been testing it. So,
okay.
Clicker.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I'm sure everybody here is now excited about the characteristics and benefits of autoscaling and Appian's next generation process execution engine. And you might be wondering, how does all of this manifest into the low-code platform, or specifically the process modeler? So first, let's start looking at the developer experience that's going to be with autoscaling for process execution. As Mark mentioned earlier, the first increment of autoscaling for process execution is specifically built for straight-through processing, service orchestration, and other unattended workflows. Now, to leverage autoscaling on these kind of use cases, developers would just have to click a checkbox in the process model properties and then any process instances of that model will automatically start leveraging the capability. So you can imagine there is no additional effort to basically leverage autoscaling in your existing applications. Developers don't have to build new models just to use this capability. So the next question you might have is, how do I identify such use cases? How do I identify my process models are fit for this capability? To answer that question and to help the developers, we are going to basically focus the process model palette and tailor the set of process nodes and smart services that are available in the process modeler that fit these kind of use cases that we are talking about. And we'll get into more details about that later as well. In addition to that, we would also be providing some in-product guidance and documentation that will help you build these process models seamlessly. So to summarize, we are making sure that the development experience is effortless, familiar, and guided when you are developing process models for autoscaling. Moreover, the processes that use autoscaling are going to be able to interact with processes that don't use autoscaling, which means that if you want to handle some exception flows, like a flow where you need a user input, you can easily create a sub-process or a start process smart service and have a process interact with each other. This way, autoscaling with process execution does not limit your applications just to high throughput use cases, but it can serve all your process orchestration across your applications. Now, we know that developer experience is not just limited to application development. It also involves monitoring. So I'm excited to tell you that autoscaling also comes with new features in process orchestration monitoring. So for processes that use autoscaling to start with, we plan to provide a seamless observability experience where you can monitor and troubleshoot processes at scale. This will include monitoring and error handling processes at high volume. Now we understand that these kind of experiences are going to be very different when you are dealing with millions of processes and you want to take action on these bulk processes. So we are going to make some changes to our monitoring features and basically also give you visibility into the infrastructure so you can make good design decisions when you are basically orchestrating your business processes. This feature is still in development, and we are going to have an initial increment at GA to start with, and then add more improvements gradually. So as you can see, autoscaling process execution and the Elastic Process Execution Engine come with a bunch of new capabilities, not just for high throughput use cases, but for other processes as well, and can make your business process orchestration in Appian much easier. Okay? Now switching gears a bit. We talked about the capabilities, we talked about the benefits, but I want to get to the core value proposition of the Elastic Process Execution Engine, which is scale and performance. To do that, I would like to share some results from the performance benchmarking tests that we have done for the Elastic Process Execution Engine. Remember that the autoscaling capability is powered by this engine, so it is important to note the benefits of the engine itself, in addition to the benefits that you would imagine elastic scaling will provide you gradually. So hopefully what we are going to talk about today give you a good idea about what kind of impact autoscaling can have on your business processes. Now for benchmarking specifically, you might expect that every process model is different. Every process model has its own characteristic. How do I make sure that a simple benchmarking can tell me what means to us? So it is important that we choose a process model which is pretty standard and which is familiar to you all. So for the benchmarking of the process execution engine, we are starting with a sample process model that we think is a good representation of an actual customer use case that we have seen in the field. And we also think that this is a good representation of all the use cases that we have been talking about in the straight-through processing world. You can imagine this particular process model, which is creating an order in Appian. Now, this process model can be started from a user on an external system. Imagine a portal. Imagine that it can be started through an external system, let's say Salesforce, where we are triggering an API into Appian and starting a process. Or it can be started through another parent process, through the sub-process node or a start process smart service. It really doesn't matter. The process can have parameters, or it can query other data from HTTP integrations, transform that data using expression rules, and also triage the flows using gateways in the process modeler. Now, one of the flows just creates an order in Appian without any manual intervention, making it a straight-through process. But you can also have some exceptions. You might want to consider some reconciliation on that data. You want to add more data and create a case for a user to look at. We are representing that through a sub-process in one of the flows in this particular process model. Now, based on the nodes and smart services that you can see in this particular process model, this can leverage autoscaling. Hopefully, this gives you an idea of what kind of process models we are targeting in the first increment, and it familiarizes you of what kind of process models you can identify at your organizations. Now, the next step of benchmarking is to establish a baseline and also know the conditions of execution. So for our benchmarking results, we are going to talk this against our Appian existing process engines, which are already part of the low-code platform. Now, as Alison mentioned at the keynote as well, our existing process engines are already highly performant, where we are running millions of process nodes per customer per day at scale. So we are, with our next generation process execution engine, we are actually pushing the boundaries of this and significantly improving on that baseline. So with that context, now I'd like to share the results of the benchmarking test for the Elastic Process Execution Engine. First, we have mentioned this before. With autoscaling, now Appian can execute more than 1 billion process actions per day per customer, which is a significant scale to support a lot of the use cases that we have mentioned in this session. To add to that, the Elastic Process Execution Engine is enabling Appian to do this with much low overhead. In our benchmarking results, we have observed that we get up to 85% less execution overhead when using EPEX. This means that your processes and the nodes that are running in the processes run with very low overhead. That means that nodes like write to data store or call integration smart services actually do not take a lot amount of time in addition to the actual evaluation time. But that is not everything. EPEX is not only pushing the boundaries with its scale, it is doing it much more efficiently. We found that the Elastic Process Execution Engine was 55% more efficient in using CPU and used 80% less memory in our benchmarking tests. Now, with these results, I hope that you can imagine that the autoscaling for process execution is a great capability for most of the high throughput use cases at your organizations, because Appian is now able to do more with less. I'd like to again remind you that these benchmarking results is for a specific representative model that we talked about and against our engines. So the results may vary when you are running this in your environment and for your process models. But the idea here is that you get an idea about what the performance impact EPEX or autoscaling is going to have on your businesses. Now, we don't only want you to take our word for it, because we have built this basically. Or we basically want to take words or take feedback from our customers as well. That's why we actually started and released a beta version of the autoscaling capability to certain customers and partners. Some of you here might already be aware that we have been running a beta program for this since the beginning of this year. So we already have 7 participants working with us since the beginning of 2024. The goal of the beta program is mainly to validate the performance of the Elastic Process Execution Engine on business processes that are at your organizations and basically test our performance with respect to your businesses and your environments. So in doing so, we are understanding your design practices, your throughput patterns, and tweaking the performance of the engine as we go along. So to continue my theme, I'd like to share some results from the beta program as well that will highlight stories from 2 of our customers from the program. The first case study I'd like to get into is an Australian insurance company that is using Appian's low-code platform to transform their business. One of the processes that they have is the data de-identification process, which is used to anonymize user data on a periodic basis. The customer actually wanted to use Appian process orchestration because of the scheduling capabilities, reporting capabilities that they have to do this. However, because of their current Appian environment, they weren't able to get to the throughput that they desired. So eventually they went ahead and implemented a high-code implementation using Python and Jenkins. Now the volume here that we're talking about is data processing, or the number of rows that we're processing in millions per month, once a month. So it's basically you to process the data once a month or twice a month, which can range into millions of rows. So now you can imagine that the high code implementation that they went ahead with comes with a really large development overhead. Now, we learned about this use case and we immediately reached out to them to get their participation in the beta program. Because of their initial evaluation of the Appian engines or of Appian or process orchestration, they already had the process models ready. That's why when they started the beta, they could immediately use autoscaling from day one and start running the processes immediately with autoscaling. And that also resulted into quickly getting the feedback for us to basically share at Appian World. So I'd like to share those results with you as well. The first thing that we were testing on is the process throughput per hour for these use cases. Now you can see here, the customer started with processing data at lower volumes. Imagine like less amount of data to start with. And you can see with and without EPEX, there isn't much difference. Maybe EPEX is slightly better, but you can still see that the existing process engines are still performing pretty well at low volume. But as you scale up, there's going to be contention in your system. As you scale more data, more rows of data being treated in Appian. And that's where EPEX performs really well. With EPEX, we could see 500% more throughput with similar amount of resources. So that is also highlighting the efficiency of EPEX. Now, we have also built the Elastic Process Execution Engine, keeping in mind speed and latency. So it's only fair to talk about that as well. Again, to set some baseline, in this case, the customer also ran the tests here at low volume. And you can see when there is low volume, there's low overhead. That means your process is going to take low amount of time if there is no additional time spent on internal operations. But as you increase your volume, or as you increase the data process in Appian, you can imagine the process nodes taking longer as there's contention on the system. But with EPEX, we could maintain consistent latency as the process execution demand increases. This is pretty important and it highlights the fast process execution times we can maintain as your demand scales in Appian. Now coming back to the beta program, these results are not just inferred by us, but we also saw direct feedback from the customers about this. This particular customer talked about the performance improvement being significant, especially when running smart services like write to data stores and write to records. And you can also include like call integration smart service in this specifically for service orchestration use cases. They also saw lower impact on the end user applications and also efficiently using resources. This is particularly attributed to the isolation of process execution that Mark was talking about earlier, where your end users are less affected because when you're running like high processing orchestration in the background. So the customer here basically concluded that with autoscaling for process execution, we can now orchestrate data processing workflows easily in Appian. Now, it was not only one customer that gave this feedback. We had sentiments echoed by another customer who is a major global insurance provider who achieved 300% more throughput in their business processes with the Elastic Process Execution Engine. And they also highlighted the speed of execution while doing so. Now, you might have noticed by now that like autoscaling is really great, but it is very great in specific use cases like we were discussing at the low volume and high volume scenarios. Now, to address that, I'd like to briefly give you some guidance which will help you decide whether autoscaling is for you right now. The first step is to identify the use cases where autoscaling can provide the best value. And we have basically categorized some use cases, or we have categorized some categories where these use cases lie, which you can identify in your business organizations. The first category is high throughput straight through processing with minimal user interaction involved. This is the kind of use cases that we are generally talking about, and it's kind of a blanket overall. The second use case can be unpredictable process execution demand, where the use cases we talked about in the beta program for the Australian insurance company, where they have to process data only once or twice a month. So you don't need the resources to be lying around for the times. The third category is orchestration of microservices, like the cases Mark mentioned earlier in the presentation. And finally, high volume data processing, like the case that we talked about in the beta program. So once you've identified and determined that your business process belongs to a particular category, the next step is to determine the compatibility. This you will be doing through the documentation and the resources we provide in the product when autoscaling is available to you. Now, and that's pretty much it. Like, you don't have to do anything else. Once you have these two steps, it's now time to start leveraging autoscaling on your existing business processes. That's all from me, and I'd like to give it back to Mark to wrap up and talk about what lies ahead.
Thanks very much, Tejas. So many years ago, as I was taught that a good presentation should be tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. And I've also was told that it's really good to always leave the audience wanting more. So allow me to apply those two principles as I try to wrap up this session. You know, process orchestration in Appian really consists of a number of different components or subsystems. You actually have, the process monitoring and controls, the process modeler. There are nodes and smart services that we talked about. There is the process execution engine, but there's also things like event handling, notifications, and human task management. So what we're doing here with this initial release is kind of a slice of this architecture. We're providing a new process execution engine. We're providing a tailored set of nodes and smart services that are particularly needed in these high-scale, high-throughput processes. But we're also providing process monitoring and controls, kind of like Tejas showed the initial mock-ups of that, and also a modicum of process history. But we don't intend to stop there, okay? We believe that EPEX, the EPEX engine is really broadly applicable, and we plan to make all of these process orchestration capabilities available with it. And these are kind of the next steps that we see that taking. And this is where this disclaimer comes in, because these plans can always change. But my point here is that first, we have to continue to expand the number of nodes and smart services that are available to you. We already have customers and partners who have told us which nodes and smart services they use in their high throughput processes, and that we need to provide support for. Those nodes and smart services really need to support the engine, high scalability. So we have some input, but in a minute we'll give you a QR code that you can use to give us more input, because we always use more input from our customers. The second thing then is really enhancements to monitoring and controls. Tejas talked about an initial increment. We've got a lot of really good ideas and just not a lot of time to get that done before our targeted GA. So we're going to provide an initial set of features for monitoring and controls, but we want to take that beyond so that you can actually monitor things like the executors and how much capacity are you using? Do I need to get more capacity? And do I need to actually hot start executors and things like that, as well as more kind of controls inside the Appian platform itself. Beyond that, notifications is really important. And actually, this is one of these areas where I feel like I might have this prioritized wrong. In fact, that it's very much related to the monitoring and control section, where notifications, how do you know that there's something's in error? You need to get notified about that. And so this is something that we might flip and do a little bit earlier than is actually alluded to here. But beyond that, we also, the major subsystem that we really want to take on is events and event handling. Things like timer events or rule events, or more importantly, the ability to natively handle data streaming and asynchronous messaging services, kind of like Apache Kafka. We actually have a team that's already starting to work on this, and that's also part of our roadmap for 2024. So we will be bringing, actually all of these now are under our process orchestration group, and so we will be working in conjunction to deliver that later on in 2024. Targeted, remember, no commit. Those four capabilities, we believe, is really what makes this value proposition much more valuable. This is really going to give you the capability to really automate these high throughput, high scale processes. And as we get our arms around that, then we can actually move to more support for self-managed customers. Okay? Now, again, that might come earlier, but right now, from my perspective, I would like these to be delivered before we move on to self-managed because we feel like it's a broader, more robust package to be delivering there. But we're not going to stop there. We want to move on to human task management and some of these other subsystems. It's just that's a little bit further down the road. We first want to complete what you need to support the unattended type workflows. So there you have it. Autoscaling for process orchestration powered by EPEX. If you have questions, if you want to provide input, if you'd like to meet with us and find out whether or not your processes can actually fit the kind of model that Tejas has been talking about, you can scan the QR code, get in touch with us. We'd really love to engage with you further on this as we move forward. I just want to thank you for your time and interest in showing up for this. We will be available in the room and outside for further questions. Thanks very much.